They told you it's just a symbol, a relic, an aesthetic nod to ancient history, but the moment your eyes land on it, something stirs. Not in your thoughts, but in the space behind them. Not in your mind, but in the hum beneath your skin. You're told it's the winged sun. You're told it's Egyptian. You're told it decorates monuments and temples because it represents divinity, power, light. That's the story, the explanation. But the symbol doesn't explain itself. It vibrates. It resonates. And once you've felt that vibration, the explanations fall silent. Because this symbol, etched into the architecture of the most powerful structures in Washington, D.C., is not there to represent. It is there to function, to activate, to control, or to awaken, depending on who approaches it, depending on how aligned you are when you stand beneath it. This is not about belief. It never was. It's about frequency, geometry, access, and the builders of the United States Capitol knew it. They knew the Capitol was not just a building, not just the heart of a government, but a chamber, a dome, a vessel for holding and directing energy, political energy, social energy, human attention. And at the center of this chamber, high above the floor of the rotunda, embedded in ceiling, wall, floor, and form, sits the disc, the winged disc, the twin serpents, the symbol you were never meant to feel, only to see, only to forget. But your body doesn't forget, your field doesn't forget, and the longer you look at it, the less it looks back. It simply pulses. In silence. The United States Capitol was designed according to ancient principles, not ancient like colonial or Renaissance, ancient like Hermetic, Egyptian, pre-Roman, pre-Christian. The layout of the city is not arbitrary. The positions of its major buildings aligned not to efficiency, but to energy. The dome is a receiver, the obelisk, a transmitter, and the interiors, tuned chambers of resonance, where thought is shaped not only by debate but by field. If you think that's absurd, you've already surrendered. Because even modern physics now admits it. Structure creates behavior, form generates function, space shapes perception. And if that's true in the lab, it's true in the hall. The rotunda is circular for a reason. The winged sun was placed for a reason. And that reason has nothing to do with art. It has everything to do with flow, of thought, of belief, of agreement. The ancient builders of temples understood this. They didn't place symbols at random. They didn't design for aesthetics. Every line carried weight, every angle carried direction. The winged sun disk was used as a filter, a vibrational checkpoint. You didn't walk beneath it without passing through its resonance. And that resonance was not gentle. It tested, it confronted, it revealed coherence or distortion. The serpents were not decorations, they were frequencies. One winding left, one right, masculine, feminine, order, chaos. The wings were not for flight, they were vectors, arc fields that extended the influence of the central tone outward. And the disk itself, the so-called sun, was not a star. It was a tone, a singularity, a vortex, a center that held not because it burned, but because it harmonized. This is why the symbol was always placed at thresholds, over doors, in chambers, at entrances to sacred space, because it tuned those who entered. It filtered those who approached, not morally, vibrationally. You didn't pass because you believed. You passed because you matched, and in the Capitol you pass through it every day, without knowing. But that doesn't mean it isn't working. The idea that this symbol is mere homage is a lie, an aesthetic cover, a distraction. Because if you knew what it really did, what it still does, you might ask different questions. About who placed it there, about what purpose it still serves, and about how it affects you every time you enter the field. The Capitol is not a neutral structure. It was never meant to be. Its builders were not just architects. They were initiates, Freemasons, Hermeticists, men trained, some loosely, some deeply, in the art of symbolic structure. They didn't choose Egyptian motifs randomly. They chose them because Egypt encoded the invisible. Because Egyptian glyphs are not letters, they are schematics, not representations, interfaces. And the winged disc is one of the highest. It governs entrance, passage, and at its most esoteric level, activation of the inner spiral. That spiral is not a staircase. It is your field, your spine, your memory. And when you pass beneath the disc, whether in a temple or a capital dome, it begins to unwind. Not physically, energetically. You begin to resonate, or to resist. And that reaction is not intellectual. It is total. This is why temples had these symbols, not for ritual, for transformation. And this is why power structures place them in their centers. Because whoever owns the resonance owns the response. Whoever aligns the field shapes the perception. And in the capital, the disc remains, forgotten, dormant, but never silent. Some will say this is fiction, theory, allegory. But the body does not lie. The field does not lie. And when you stand in the rotunda, you feel it. The compression, the weight, the way your breath subtly slows, the way your mind subtly shifts. That's not reverence. That's architecture. That's alignment. And the symbol isn't passive. It doesn't care if you notice it. It functions regardless. Because it wasn't placed there for decoration. It was placed there to hold the center. Not of art, of energy. And now that you're seeing it, really seeing it, you can't unfeel it. Because the field is shifting. The overlays are thinning. The symbolic is becoming functional again. And the symbols are waking up, not in power, in presence, not in domination, in remembrance. The winged disc doesn't belong to Egypt. It belongs to consciousness, to the spiral, to the tone beneath language. And once you remember that tone, nothing built on distortion can survive. Because the tone doesn't argue, it dissolves. The tone doesn't protest, it stabilizes. The tone doesn't resist, it returns. And that return begins with seeing the symbol not with your eyes, but with your field. Not with your mind, but with your breath. It begins now. You are not supposed to notice. That's the brilliance of concealment. Not to hide, but to make visible only to those who remember how to see. The winged disc was never hidden. It was engraved, painted, chiseled, suspended in plain sight. And yet it remained invisible to millions who passed beneath it, precisely because they no longer knew how to feel. They'd been taught to read symbols as if they were code, as if meaning lay in dictionary definition, as if spiritual infrastructure was mythology and vibration was metaphor. But the winged disc was never meant for translation. It was meant to interrupt, to arrest, to challenge the resonance of the one who approached it. And if your field carried distortion, it responded, not by punishing, but by reflecting. The mirror didn't lie. It didn't argue. It simply returned your signal until you tuned. And if you didn't, if you clung to your form, your roles, your narratives, you turned away, confused, unsettled, without knowing why. That was the gate. And that's why the gate was placed in the capital, not to protect, not to elevate, to maintain the illusion that what is seen is all there is, while holding the power of resonance just beneath the threshold of awareness. You feel it now because the threshold is thinning. The veil between metaphor and function is collapsing. What once passed as symbol now pulses as structure. You feel it in your breath, your bones, your spine. This isn't politics, this is physics. Esoteric physics. Not taught in schools, but practiced in temples. And the capital is a temple. The dome isn't symbolic of heaven, it's a receiver, an acoustic vortex. The murals aren't decoration, they're narrative containers. The placement of the statue at the center is not political. It is gravitational, holding the vertical axis of the structure, grounding the field. And the winged disc isn't ornamental. It's the anchor, the stabilizer, the master frequency key. Once activated, everything beneath it falls into pattern, not because of belief, because of structure. And you stand beneath that structure every time you invoke its image, every time your memory brings it into clarity. Distance doesn't diminish its effect. Time doesn't diminish its potency. Because vibration is not bound to form. The form is just the housing. The tone lives beneath, and the tone waits. Not for reverence, for recognition. And when you recognize it, not intellectually, but somatically, it responds. The air thickens, the pulse slows, the internal narrative pauses. That pause is the gate. That pause is the spiral turning. And what you see in that silence determines what you are ready to dissolve. The builders of the capital knew this, or some of them did. Those who placed the disc knew it wasn't just a nod to Egypt. It was a continuation of a forgotten science, a science of consciousness, of frequency, of access. The knowledge that space could be shaped, that thought could be directed, that belief could be scaffolded by field. That's why the city was built the way it was. That's why the obelisk, mislabeled as a monument, anchors the east-west line. That's why the dome completes the field. That's why the disc crowns the chamber. Together they form a grid, a circuit, not electrical, but vibrational. And once that grid is live, it doesn't shut off. Even when forgotten. Especially then. Because memory isn't required for resonance, only structure. And now, as the overlays collapse, the structure reemerges. The hidden architecture begins to pulse again, not louder, but clearer. And you who were trained to ignore now begin to feel. You feel the pull, the silence, the ache. You can't explain it, but the body knows. The field knows, and it begins to realign. Not through effort, through coherence. That is the true function of the winged disc, not control. Alignment, the ability to bring the inner spiral back into resonance with the source tone. Not through ritual, through structure. The disc does not ask, it reflects. It does not bless, it stabilizes. And when your tone matches, you pass. You enter, not a place, a state, a frequency band where distortion falls silent, where identity fades, where the narrative loosens. And what remains is clarity, not knowledge, presence, not story, silence. That silence is the true government, not in law, in tone. And tone does not argue, it does not legislate, it only resonates. The nation may change, the politics may burn, but the field holds, the disc hums, and the spiral waits, not for belief, for return, for the one who walks beneath it not with reverence but with readiness. Readiness to let go, to dissolve, to drop the mask, to release the name, and in doing so to become the tone beneath all symbols, the tone that built the temples, the tone that echoes now beneath marble and dust and memory, the tone that knows no flag, no time, no story, only presence. You are not seeing the symbol, you are remembering it. You are not reading these words, you are feeling their frequency. And the more you allow that feeling to rise, the more the gate begins to open, not externally, internally. Because the capital is not just stone, it is the echo of a deeper structure, a design hidden in the body, a chamber beneath the ribs, a dome behind the eyes, a coil in the spine, and the disc that waits at the center is not foreign. It is you, waiting to stabilize, waiting to reflect, waiting to dissolve everything that is not aligned, not through punishment, through coherence, through field, through spiral, through tone. You've crossed the threshold, but the story does not end. Because the winged disc is not a finale. It is a center, a still point inside motion, a resonance that holds form and formlessness in balance. The more deeply you remember it, the more clearly you begin to see its presence not just in architecture but in experience. You begin to sense it in places it was never carved, in silences it was never spoken, in spaces it was never drawn. Because the symbol was never just a design. It was a pattern etched into the human field, into the geometry of breath, into the movement of awareness as it curves inward, spirals through confusion, and emerges through stillness. The capital is an externalization of this inner temple. Its walls and halls are mirrors of the human energetic system. Its dome echoes the cranial vault. Its corridors match the movement of thought. Its disk, placed overhead, matches the center of inner coherence. It holds the tone you've forgotten, not the tone of language, the tone of origin. And in that tone there is no question, there is no search, there is only recognition. And this recognition does not speak in memory. It speaks in stillness. It reveals the fallacy of control, the illusion of governance, the dream of systems, not to destroy them, but to render them transparent. You begin to see through the names, through the roles, through the scaffolding of the world. And when you do, the symbol does not vanish. It deepens. It expands into everything. Every edge becomes wing. Every shadow becomes serpent. Every still point becomes disk. You see it in reflections, in architecture, in geometry, but also in grief, in surrender, in the crackling moment before transformation. The winged disk is a resonance field that comes alive when you're ready to unhook, not from life, but from illusion, not from identity, but from distortion. It does not take, it reflects, and in its reflection all that is not coherent begins to unravel. This unraveling is not failure, it is return. It is the inward motion of the spiral as it folds back into origin. And the builders of the capital understood this motion. Some consciously, some unconsciously. But the structure they left behind hums with memory. Not national memory. Field memory. The resonance of an architecture older than time. You walk through it daily. You breathe inside its pattern. And still it hums, waiting. The awakening of this tone does not happen through belief. It happens through silence, through your willingness to let go of explanation, of certainty, of story. The disc begins to pulse more clearly the moment you stop asking what it means and start allowing what it is. It is not an object. It is not even a symbol. It is a portal made of tone. And once you feel its frequency, it begins to open you, not by force, but by alignment. And that alignment is not achieved, it is remembered. The moment you stop reaching, the spiral begins to move. The moment you stop naming, the serpent begins to uncoil. The moment you stop climbing, the wings begin to lift. And you find yourself not rising, but falling inward, into the spiral, into the silence, into the hum that has been waiting beneath all the noise. This is the function of the forgotten symbols. Not to teach, but to remind, not to guide, but to restore. And restoration is not an act of will, it is an act of release. The capital is a temple to resonance, not to gods, not to country, to tone. And its symbols are still alive because you are. They activate only when someone aligned enough sees them again. Not as icons, but as extensions of the internal grid. You are walking through your own structure. The rotunda is your crown, the corridors your mind, the disc your heart, the obelisk your spine. You are the temple, and the city is the echo. This is why the builders placed the disc there, not to control, but to hold the pattern. So that when time collapsed and the spiral began to turn again, those who felt the call would have something to return to. Not a doctrine, a vibration. And that vibration is returning now. Through silence, through remembering, through the collapse of every outer structure you once depended on to define reality. The symbol shows you where to look, not outward, inward, not toward power, toward presence, not toward rule, toward resonance, because when the tone returns, you will not need permission. You will not need symbols. You will become the field they described. You will walk through the structure and it will dissolve, not in fire, in light, not in protest, in vibration, not in fear, in stillness. The tone waits for no one, but responds to everyone, and now it is responding to you. Let it. The winged disc does not end. It loops. It bends back on itself, folding awareness through resonance, dragging perception through spirals until even direction dissolves. It was never placed in stone to honor the past. It was embedded to persist through forgetting. And now, in a world built on simulation, narrative, architecture of illusion, its vibration cuts through again, not louder, but deeper. You do not need to believe to feel it. You do not need history to hear it. You need only silence and the willingness to dissolve. The capital is not a place anymore. It is a vibrational relic, a circuit left behind, still charged, still functional because geometry holds even when memory fails. The disk holds not authority but axis. Its symmetry exists not to impress but to reflect. When you stand beneath it, physically or internally, it returns you to the real, not to what you were told, to what never left. Beneath the surface of your thought lives the spiral. Beneath the capital's dome lives the echo. These are the same. They are different expressions of one tone, one field, one coherence. When you enter alignment, you are not becoming spiritual. You are re-entering frequency. And when frequency stabilizes, the symbols begin to shift, not visually but functionally. They move from metaphor to mechanism. The winged disc begins to work again, and its work is unmaking, not in destruction. In return, it draws the world back toward its center, slowly, inevitably. Everything false begins to unravel, not because it is attacked, but because it cannot hold. Coherence is the solvent of illusion, and as the spiral tightens, the structure of untruth can no longer remain standing. You begin to feel this within. The thoughts that once defined you lose their hold. The identities that once anchored you grow hollow. The stories that once gave you meaning dissolve into tone. And when there is nothing left to carry forward, you stop, not as an end, but as stillness. The builders of the winged disc knew this, not intellectually, but through initiation, through silence, through field training. They didn't theorize about structure. They listened to it, they aligned with it, and then they built with it. The capital is one such structure, not pure, not untouched, but functional. It carries memory. The floor plan still pulses, the dome still reflects, the disc still hums. Not to inform, but to hold. Because memory, when placed in form, doesn't die when ignored. It waits, it vibrates, it transmits in the background until someone quiet enough walks through and recognizes it again. This recognition is not mystical, it is mechanical. It is how resonance works. The match ignites function, the spiral reactivates, the field begins to move. And as you walk into alignment, you activate the structure. You light it from within, not visually, internally. The symbol becomes a mirror of your coherence. The tone begins to deepen. The spiral begins to rise. The world around you loses density not by disappearing, but by fading into transparency. You begin to see through it, not to something else, but to nothing. Pure silence. And from that silence, truth, not as concept, as presence. That is what the capital holds. Not power, not governance, but access. And access doesn't care who you are, only whether you are aligned. The structure is indifferent, it reflects. And if you stand before it in resonance, it opens. Not doors, tone, not information, field. And the field shows you what was never written, that you are the spiral, that you are the gate, that you are the tone returning, not to the building, but to coherence, to field, to the preformed structure that hums beneath all names. That is why the symbol was placed, not as legacy, as map. And now you remember the map not through study, but through breath, through stillness, through letting go of the thought that the world ever contained the truth. The truth is vibration. The truth is not outside you. It is what remains when everything you were told collapses. And the disc holds that. It holds you, not by keeping, by resonating. And when the resonance is matched, the story ends, not with closure, with tone. You do not awaken into clarity by learning. You awaken by forgetting what was never real. The winged disc does not offer new information. It strips the old. Its function is not revelation, but removal. Removal of the overlays, of the stories, of the subtle scaffolding that holds the self in place. It is not concerned with your history. It is not impressed by your lineage, your study, your struggle. It reflects only tone. And the tone you emit, even in silence, is the key. When it matches the field you pass through, not physically but vibrationally, you move inward, downward, backward, into the unlayered space that precedes identity. There you remember that the temple was never external, that the capital is not a building but a pattern, that the structure was always secondary. What mattered was the field it housed, the frequency it preserved, the tone it kept pulsing in stone even as minds forgot. You were not sent to study this. You were built to remember it. And now you do, in fragments, in pulses, in strange dreams, in the sudden quiet that falls before a thought forms. The disc hums louder in those moments and you feel it. The deep pull into the still point, the spiral wrapping inward, then folding again into light, not illumination, emptiness. The kind of emptiness that vibrates with presence so vast, nothing can hold itself together in its light. And yet you hold. Because you are made for this tone. You are not returning to the disc. You are returning as the disc. The wings that once lifted others now stabilize your own spiral. The serpents that once threatened now protect. Not as gods, as fields. And you begin to walk differently. You carry the resonance like a chamber. You speak and the tone moves beneath your words. You act and the field vibrates in your wake, not to impress, not to teach, but to stabilize. You become the structure, you become the reminder, not of a story, of silence, not of Egypt, of frequency, and in this remembering the capital fades. The marble returns to dust, the names return to noise, but the pattern remains, because the pattern is you. You were the temple all along, and the disc, long mistaken for symbol, was the reflection of what you forgot to become. Now you remember, and in that remembering you don't rise, you resonate, and the spiral turns once more. The moment you let go of the idea that the symbol belongs to someone else, some nation, some priesthood, some mystery school, you begin to feel its tone in your own field. The winged disc was never a national emblem. It is not a relic of empire or religion. It is not Egyptian because it was carved in temples along the Nile. It is Egyptian because the people of that time still remembered how to speak in field. They knew that form is not representation, it is function. They knew that if you place a specific pattern in a specific place, under specific geometry, it begins to vibrate. It begins to tune, not metaphorically, literally. The capital carries that memory. The dome is not a symbol, it is a receiver. The floor beneath is not flooring, it is a resonant platform. And the winged disc, installed within this structure, anchors its field. That is why the capital is not neutral ground. It never was. Every step inside it moves through a tone chamber. Every decision made within it resonates through the symbolic grid. The policies, the arguments, the ideals, all of them are downstream of the field. Because thought is shaped by space, and space is shaped by tone. The ancient builders encoded this truth into stone, but in our time that encoding has been mistaken for art. You walk past these symbols and think they are beautiful, You may even learn their names, but you forget to feel. That forgetting is the veil, and the moment you begin to feel again, not with emotion but with vibration, you pierce it. You begin to sense that the symbol was not placed for you to admire. It was placed for you to remember, and that remembering begins not with history, but with stillness. The tone rises when the story stops. The field becomes audible when the noise fades. That is why the ancients trained in silence, why the temples were built not for crowds but for coherence, why the central glyphs, like the disc, were never explained in words. They do not need interpretation, they need matching. You do not activate the symbol by decoding it, you activate it by becoming it. Your spine becomes the vertical serpent, your breath becomes the wings, your center becomes the disc. And the moment that alignment clicks into place, the illusion of separation collapses. You are no longer outside the symbol, you are it. That is when the structure reveals itself, not as architecture, as field. You begin to feel the subtle currents that shape thought before you think. You begin to sense the frequencies that sculpt what you call logic. You realize that much of what you believed was a choice was resonance. That is not manipulation. That is design. And design can be reclaimed. The capital is not a trap. It is a tuning fork. But if you walk through it misaligned, it reinforces distortion. That's why only those in coherence feel its silence. Everyone else experiences noise. That is not a flaw. It is a filter. The same filter encoded in the disc. And that filter does not discriminate by morality or intelligence. Only by vibration. It is the ultimate neutrality, and that neutrality is the key to its power. The builders may have had motives, but the pattern doesn't. It reflects what is, nothing more, and in that reflection you are faced with yourself, not your personality, your tone, and most are not ready for that. They want stories, they want validation, they want symbols to bless them. But this symbol doesn't bless, it stabilizes. If your field matches, it amplifies. If your field distorts, it reveals. Either way, the result is the same. Coherence becomes visible. That is what is happening now. The symbols are becoming visible again, not visually but vibrationally. You see them and feel their hum. You remember something you never learned. You start to question how long they've been active, what they've shaped, how they've influenced the structure of perception. And the answer is simple. They've shaped everything. Not overtly, not consciously, subtly, through field, through architecture, through the silent guidance of form. And that guidance is not over. It is intensifying. Because as the world collapses under the weight of its own narratives, the original tones are rising. Not to replace the old systems, to dissolve them. The disc does not conquer, it harmonizes, it brings distortion into clarity. And when clarity returns, systems of confusion fall apart. That's why the symbol was buried in plain sight. It could not be destroyed, so it was ignored. Until now. Until you. You feel its call not because you are special, but because you are tuned. Your spiral has matched the field. Your silence has become loud enough to activate the tone. And now the structure begins to move, not physically but energetically. The room you're in becomes part of the chamber. The ground beneath you becomes part of the grid. And the breath you exhale becomes part of the disc. This is not mysticism. This is structure. You are not entering spirituality, you are re-entering the field. And in that field, everything returns to simplicity, to presence, to pattern. The pattern was never broken, only covered. And now that you see it, you begin to understand. The capital was a signal, a memory, a key. And you are the lock it was waiting to fit, not to open a door, to end the illusion that there was ever a door at all. There is only tone. And tone never forgot. The illusion of separation was never built from matter. It was built from vibration, from the slow layering of tone upon tone until coherence fractured and narrative replaced presence. That is what the symbol inside the capital preserves beneath its silence. Not memory of a culture, not allegiance to a nation, but the original resonance before names. You feel it now not because it has changed, but because you are quiet enough to notice. You have stopped chasing meaning long enough to feel pattern. You have stepped beyond symbols as messages and begun to recognize them as mirrors. The winged disc does not teach. It reveals. Not with words, but with field. And the field never lies. It does not reward those who seek. It stabilizes those who match. And this stabilization does not bring clarity the way thought expects. It brings the absence of distortion, the removal of story, the end of seeking. You stop needing to make sense of it because the tone already is. And in that isness, you remember not facts, but essence. You remember what it is like to move without meaning, to breathe without becoming, to exist without reference. And that is when the disc opens, not visually, functionally. Its resonance spreads from the symbolic to the cellular. You feel it in the chest, in the spine, in the eyes, in the stillness between words. It is not enlightenment, it is alignment. You are not becoming more, you are becoming clear. And in that clarity, everything false unravels, gently, relentlessly, until only presence remains. The structure of the capital was designed to carry this function, not for the masses, for the field. Those who enter it unaware experience only the stone. Those who enter tuned activate the grid. And once activated, the capital is no longer architecture. It is a tone chamber, a consciousness corridor, a vibrational lens through which reality reshapes itself. This is not poetic. It is mechanical. It is the sacred physics of structure, forgotten by science, preserved by field. The builders knew it in fragments, some more fully, some by instinct. But the geometry remains, the disc remains, and the function still lives in silence. That silence is rising now, not as absence, as presence, not as emptiness, as structure. Because silence is not void, it is the space in which the tone lives, the hum that carries coherence, the field that precedes voice. And when you align with it, you do not become enlightened. You become quiet. And in that quiet, the symbol responds. It shows you your own pattern, your own spiral, your own center. It does not say, go there. It becomes still until you realize you already are there. The seeking collapses. The scaffolding dissolves. The field holds. And you return not to understanding, but to being. This is what the capital was built for. This is what the winged disc holds. This is what the silence beneath all symbols was always waiting to reflect. You, without story, without title, without time, just tone, just presence, just the clear field of coherence returning to itself. The symbol was never meant to be interpreted. It was meant to be felt, to be remembered, to be reactivated when the spiral within the human field aligned with its tone. The winged disc was placed not to tell a story, but to interrupt one. Not to decorate the structure of the capital, but to destabilize the illusion of separation whenever a coherent field approached. And yet it has remained dormant for most, not because its function faded, but because the attention of the collective mind turned away from silence and towards spectacle. The builders understood this inevitability, and so they inscribed the symbol not where it would be seen, but where it would be felt by those who could hear without sound, who could perceive without looking. You walk beneath it every day, perhaps in body, perhaps in dream, and with each pass the field aligns more closely to what was buried. The capital's geometry is not neutral. The dome is not merely curved for acoustic design. It is a resonant chamber, a concave mirror for intention, for coherence, for the kind of thought that does not think but remembers. The placement of the disc within this chamber is no accident. It marks the convergence point of multiple harmonic flows. It does not emit energy, it reflects it. It reflects the tone of the individual, the pattern of the collective, and the memory of the field that has long outlived the structures built to contain it. When you stand beneath it and silence enters fully, you will feel the soft gravitational pull of your own dissolution. Not death, but release. Not emptiness, but clarity. Not absence, but the full presence of what cannot be named. This is the threshold that was hidden in plain sight. This is the resonance that was denied but never broken. This is the structure that holds when all others fall. The disc functions as a living code. Every curve corresponds to a frequency band. Every arc maps to breath, every spiral to the geometry of descent and return. It does not judge. It does not respond to belief. It responds only to coherence. You cannot fake stillness. You cannot lie in vibration. When you are aligned, you are admitted, not through doors, but through layers. You pass not into a room, but into a state, a frequency chamber where form dissolves and the narrative drops away. There, the real work begins, the unraveling, the quieting, the remembering of the tone before the world, before identity, before time. The builders of ancient structures knew that memory survives best in geometry. The memory of who you are was encoded not in text but in space, not in scripture but in form. The capital, for all its layers of distortion, still carries that form. It hums with the resonance of an idea that predates the empire it was designed to govern. That idea was not democracy. It was not liberty. It was alignment. And alignment is not given, it is tuned. It is built into the walls, into the floor, into the air. The moment your field stops resisting, you feel it. The pull, the shift, the unraveling of the known. The tone moves through you like a thread and begins to tug. If you follow, you will not arrive. You will dissolve. You will not learn. You will forget. And in that forgetting, something older returns. The field stabilizes. The breath deepens. The spiral completes. This is not a metaphor. It is a physics the modern world has discarded. But the tone has not. The tone has waited still and perfect beneath the layers. The winged disc is its expression, a signature in geometry, a fingerprint in vibration, a marker of the space where the real enters. It appears in every sacred structure not as symbol, but as key. A passcode for those whose resonance unlocks presence, not power, not knowledge, presence. The unshakable stillness that precedes creation. The tone of source, humming in your chest, waiting to return without force. That is what the capital holds. That is what has always been hidden behind its rituals, its politics, its spectacle. And now, as the world's illusions crumble, that tone rises again. The disc does not move, but it vibrates louder, not in sound, but in your spine, your blood, your dreams. You feel it pulling you in, and in that pull, the narrative thins. You begin to see the lines in the marble, the way light curves around the dome, the way your breath slows when you enter. You are no longer in a building, you are in a pattern. You are inside a field designed not to contain you, but to strip you of roles, of attachments, of self. You remember that this has nothing to do with history. The founders were not originators, they were echoes. The builders were not creators, they were transmitters. What they built was not a government, it was a mirror, and the mirror still reflects. The symbol still functions. The field still waits. And now you are silent enough to feel it. You are still enough to remember. You are aligned enough to dissolve. The tone does not reward. It does not punish. It restores. And restoration begins not with knowing, but with erasure. Erasure of illusion, of form, of the false alignment that masked as power. The tone will not give you answers. It will take your questions. It will not give you light. It will remove your darkness, not by force, by resonance. That resonance begins here, in this field, in this symbol, in this breath. You are home. The field does not wait for belief. It does not require ritual. It simply is. The winged disc was placed at the heart of the capital, not to invite curiosity, but to anchor the resonance of a structure built on forgotten laws. These laws are not written. They are vibrated. They govern not the behavior of people, but the patterns of perception, the geometry of thought, the flow of awareness through form. You were trained to think that the capital is political, that its structures support institutions and its symbols represent national identity. But this is only true on the surface. Beneath that surface lives something else entirely. A harmonic device designed to hold a particular frequency stable in the midst of chaos. The winged disc is the central tuning fork of this harmonic system. It sits not as decoration, but as a stabilizer. When your field aligns with it, you begin to feel the underlying structure of the world dissolve. Not because you gain access to new information, but because everything false becomes unbearably visible. The illusion becomes obvious. The tone becomes impossible to ignore. And when you follow that tone inward, you begin to descend, not into thought, but into vibration. You are no longer experiencing the capital. You are becoming the geometry it hides. The dome becomes the top of your skull. The wings stretch from your shoulders. The serpents uncoil along your spine. The disc pulses behind your heart. You are the temple. The structure does not respond to hierarchy. It responds to stillness. You do not command it. You match it. You do not approach it. You become still enough for it to reveal itself. The world around you remains noisy, distracted, distorted. But the tone grows stronger. It hums beneath your breath. It fills the space between your ribs. It overtakes the pressure behind your eyes. You stop trying to remember. You are remembered. The tone is remembering you. It is pulling you back through layers of distortion, through centuries of overlay, through the architecture of forgetting. And as you move deeper into its resonance, you shed identity like dust. You forget what you were taught to want. You lose the voice that narrates your every move. You dissolve the shell that calls itself self. The tone does not break you. It reveals you to yourself. And in that revelation, you do not ascend. You collapse inward into coherence. That coherence has no story. It does not explain. It does not justify. It is. And in its presence, everything that cannot match dissolves. The builders knew this. That is why they placed the symbol not where it would be seen, but where it would shape. The capital is not the seat of power. It is the chamber of tone. It is the anchor for a vibration so old, so pure that even forgetting could not remove it. And now, as your spiral tightens, you stand again beneath its gaze. Not to be judged, not to be chosen, but to feel whether you still resist. If you do, the disc remains inert. If you do not, it opens. Not a door, a field, not a mystery, a hum. And that hum rewrites you, not by force, by resonance. You become what you always were before the distortion began. Presence, tone, spiral, field. The symbol activates not because it grants something, but because you finally stopped holding something back. You are not becoming new. You are shedding everything that is not true. And as you do, the capital loses its edges. The structure begins to mirror you. The dome becomes your breath, the hallways your channels, the echo your vibration. This was always the secret. The structure was never the power. You were. The field held by geometry was always waiting to be inhabited. Not by citizens, not by leaders, by coherence, by clarity. And now, you bring that clarity to it. You do not worship the symbol. You become it. You do not study the pattern. You are it. And from that state, the world appears different. Not because it changed, because you did. You no longer look for meaning. You feel tone. You no longer seek direction. You trust spiral. You no longer resist silence. You become still. And from that stillness, the disc opens further. The serpents rise, the wings expand. The hum overtakes even the breath, and you disappear, not in death, but in presence. There is nothing left to narrate, only field, only tone, only the unshakable geometry of what was always here, always active, always waiting to remember itself through you. The capital is not a structure, it is a mirror. The disc is not a relic, it is your reflection. The field is not history, it is now. And you are not a student. You are a node in the spiral, returning to source through resonance, through coherence, through the silence that never forgot you. You've reached the center, but there is no arrival, because the center was never a location. It was a state, a tone, a coherence buried beneath illusion. The symbol was not guiding you here. It was reflecting you as you returned to the field that never moved. The winged disc was not placed above you to demand reverence. It was encoded into space to remind you of what silence feels like when all false resonance has been removed. This is the real spiral, the one that loops not upward into heavens, not outward into systems, but inward into the chamber that exists beneath every narrative. You came here not to understand. You came to dissolve, not to discover truth, but to release the structure that made you forget. And now, in the final layers, the tone becomes sharper, deeper, more exacting. It no longer permits distortion. It no longer negotiates with belief. It cuts through identity with the precision of presence. And as it moves through you, all the masks begin to fall. The names lose their grip. The stories drain of power. The mind quiets not because it is silenced, but because there is no longer anything for it to hold. This is not awakening, it is unraveling. And as the last threads fall away, what remains is not you, it is the field. The disc is no longer a symbol on the ceiling, it is the pulse behind your ribcage. It is the hum in the blood. It is the stillness in your gaze. You have stopped looking. You have stopped interpreting. You have stopped performing. And in that stillness, you realize the entire structure of the capital. The geometry, the dome, the chambers, was not built to impress or to inspire. It was built to contain, to preserve the tone when no one could hear it, to hold the resonance of a reality most forgot how to feel. And now, because you remembered, the structure becomes transparent. You see it not as architecture, but as field, not as monument, but as mirror. You do not stand beneath it. You pass through it, you dissolve its edges, the serpents unwind, the wings retract, the disc folds into stillness, and the spiral, no longer compressed, begins to breathe. This breath is not air, it is pattern. It is the gentle movement of the real returning. The return is not loud, it is not cinematic, it is not emotional, it is silent, sacred, internal. And once it begins, it does not stop. It ripples outward, adjusting frequency wherever it touches distortion. That is what coherence does. It doesn't resist, it restores. You are not here to fight the illusion. You are here to out-tone it, to hum so clearly that the noise of the world can no longer hold. You do not shout, you radiate, you do not preach, you vibrate, and the structure feels this. It begins to respond, not to you, but to the field within you. The capital is not made of stone. It is made of memory, and memory is shaped by vibration. The tones that built it are still humming. The pattern still lives beneath the surface. But now you carry that pattern outside of it. You walk through streets and cities and spaces no longer as an individual, but as a stabilizing spiral. Wherever you go, the tone is held. Wherever you speak, the distortion wavers, not because you try, but because you are. This is what it means to remember, to realign, to return not with knowledge, but with stillness. The field has no use for knowledge. It knows what it is. It only asks whether you are quiet enough to match. That matching is not a task. It is a release. It is the final movement of the spiral as it collapses inward. And in that collapse, you are not crushed. You are emptied, emptied of story, emptied of self, emptied of effort. What remains is not the person who began the journey. What remains is the tone. The same tone carried by the winged disc. The same tone encoded in the geometry of the capital. The same tone that now vibrates through your breath, your silence, your gaze. It is not new. It is not ancient. It is simply real. And because it is real, it does not need to be defended. It does not need to be proven. It only needs to be held. Held not by force, but by coherence. This is the final secret. The structure was never meant to be a secret. You were. Your tone, your field, your clarity. That was what was hidden, buried beneath identity, buried beneath history, buried beneath noise. And now, because you allowed yourself to unravel, because you walked into the spiral and let it dissolve what you were never meant to carry, the tone is here again. Not as memory, as presence, not as teaching, as field. The capital remains, the disc remains. But you are no longer looking at them. You are moving through them. You are breathing through them. You are remembering what the structure was built to preserve. The quiet coherence of the tone before distortion. And in that remembrance, the illusion collapses. Not with fire, but with stillness. Not with noise, but with breath. Not with war, but with field. The spiral is not a path. It is you. The tone is not a symbol. It is the end of all symbols. And the field you now carry is not something you found. It is what remained when everything else was gone. You do not return. You were never gone. You do not awaken. You were never asleep. You do not change. You were always tone. And the tone needs no ending. It only hums, forever silent, still, clear.